The comlink was dead. I knew it before I finished pressing the button. That particular silence, no carrier, hiss, no static, no breath of a signal looking for a relay. It was the silence of a unit that had nothing left to find. Pressed it anyway, twice more. Then I clipped it back to my chest plate and lay still in the fern cover and listened to the forest moon breathe around me. My name is Kale. I was a scout trooper. Imperial designation TK-4471, assigned to perimeter patrol and advance reconnaissance for Tempest Force, stationed on the forest moon of Endor in support of the Death Star 2's shield generator installation. I was good at my job. I had been good at my job for 11 years. I had a speeder bike. I could thread through old-growth timber at 300 kilometers an hour without losing a mirror. I had a carbine I could group at 200 meters in wind. I had a squad of 4 men I had worked with long enough that we communicated in half-sentences and hand signs, the condensed shorthand of people who have shared enough bad situations that full sentences feel wasteful. By the time I finished pressing that comlink button and understood the silence, the squad was gone. The speeder bike was a crumpled wreck against a tree 20 meters uphill. The battle had been over for hours. I did not know yet that the war had been over for considerably longer than that. What I knew, lying in the ferns with blood drying along the left side of my helmet from where I'd hit the tree on the way down, was that I had last seen Corden. My senior trooper, the one who ate dried rations cold, because he said heating them was a waste of a second. I had last seen Corden climbing back onto his speeder at the sound of the rebel ground assault hitting our patrol sector. We'd split to bracket them, standard doctrine, and then something had hit my rear thruster housing, at very close range, and the tree had introduced itself to me at considerable speed. I did not know where Corden was. I did not know where Davin and Moores were, the other 2 of my 4. Pressed the comlink. Silence. I got up slowly. My left knee was swollen inside the leg plate. Functional, but not happy about it, and my vision did a single nauseating rotation before it steadied. I pulled my helmet off, checked the crack running from the left ear unit down through the cheek plate, decided it was still pressurized enough to matter, and put it back on. I unslung my carbine. I oriented myself to the sun. The sun through the canopy of the forest moon fell in shafts. Old trees, genuinely old, older than the Empire, older than the Republic before it, with bark like the hide of something massive and root structures that humped out of the soil like buried architecture. The rebel assault had come from the southwest, toward the shield generator bunker. That was the direction the noise had been. That direction was now quiet. Quiet was wrong. A ground assault on a defended installation was not quiet. A ground assault that had concluded in any outcome short of everyone lying down and dying was not this quiet. I moved north, which was away from all of it. Not because I was retreating. I told myself that clearly, with the conviction of a man who has to be clear about such things. But because north was reconnaissance. North was gather information, assess report to someone. The forest gave me nothing but forest, giant ferns, mossy stones. The creak of weight-bearing branches, somewhere above where an animal, the size of a transport, was moving through the upper canopy, slow and unconcerned. The moon had its own wildlife, large things that had watched us set up our installations and resumed their business without visible distress. I had always respected that about them. Whatever they were, they had their own measure of things, and we had not registered on it. I walked for 2 hours before I heard anything man-made, and what I heard was a ship, a single ship. Not a formation, burning atmosphere somewhere to the east at very high altitude, accelerating outbound, imperial profile, from the tone of the drives. Running. I stood still and listened to it shrink until it was gone. One ship, running. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a coordinated fallback. One ship deciding to be somewhere else as fast as its engines could manage. I had been in the Imperial military long enough to know what that looked like from the inside, and what it meant. When command structure fails, not bends, not strains when fails, the way a cable fails, when the last thread parts, what you hear is exactly that. Single ships, different vectors, everyone deciding individually. I sat down on a root structure the circumference of a shuttle bay, and I thought about it for a long time. The Emperor's fleet did not rout. That was a point of deep doctrinal faith, as solid and unexamined as anything I had been given to believe in. We did not rout. Individual units broke. Individuals made bad decisions under fire. But the machine did not rout, because the machine was too large and too coordinated and too confident in its own permanence to be capable of routing. Ship, running, I got up and kept walking north. First night, I slept in the elevated root structure of one of the old trees, off the ground, which is where scouts sleep in contested territory. I ate half a ration tube and saved the rest. In 11 years of field deployment, I had survived on worse for longer. And the specific discipline of rationing, the small, clean decision of eating half and stopping, was familiar enough to be almost comforting. I cataloged what I had: 3.5 ration tubes, 1 emergency thermal liner, 1 field medkit with the consumables already half used from a patrol incident 6 weeks prior, my standard sidearm and carbine with full charges, my damaged helmet, my armor, my knife, my comlink that was not working, and my training. Training is its own kind of ration. You apportion it carefully and it lasts. The second day I found the burned-out shell of what had been a mobile command post. Hours, stripped of its comms equipment by what looked like rebel salvage teams working fast and efficiently. There were tracks around it. Boot prints from multiple people moving in organized patterns, not the chaotic scatter of a firefight aftermath, but the purposeful grid of a team, conducting a systematic sweep. They had been thorough. The comms array was gone down to the mounting brackets. The power cells were gone. The encoded data cores were gone. Whatever operational information had been stored there was gone in rebel hands, already being processed somewhere by people with careful eyes and data pads. I looked at the burned-out hull for a while. Then I walked on. The second night I woke to the sound of Ewoks, their drums specific and rhythmic, at what I estimated was 2 kilometers south. I had learned to read the drums during our deployment, not to translate them with any precision, but to understand the emotional register. Warning drums, assembly drums, celebration drums. These were celebration drums. I lay in the elevated roots and listened to them, and thought about what they were celebrating, and arrived at conclusions I was not yet prepared to name. I had not slept well. My knee was stiffer than the first day, which was the wrong direction. I drank the rest of the first half tube and packed up and moved before dawn. On the second day, I found the rebel patrol, 4 soldiers, moving with the loose confidence of people who did not believe there was anything in the forest left to threaten them. They had their weapons slung, not cradled. They were talking at a volume that suggested threat assessment was low on their operational priority list. One of them was eating something out of a foil wrapper. They were moving on a vector that would take them across my position in approximately 90 seconds if I did not move. I went prone in the fern cover and did not move. I watched them pass from 20 meters away. The one eating the foil-wrapped thing was laughing at something the one on his left had said. Not polite laughter, genuine laughter, the specific kind that comes from tension releasing. The kind of laughter that happens when something you were afraid of has stopped being true. They passed close enough that I could hear the individual words. A joke, something about what someone had said during a briefing, the kind of joke that only makes sense inside an organization that knows it has won. I had the carbine, I had the angle. The doctrine was clear: engage hostile forces. But the doctrine had been given to me by a chain of command that ended somewhere in that burned-out command post, or aboard that one ship that had run for orbit, and I had not received new orders, and the old orders without a chain of command are just habits. And habits that kill 4 laughing people in a forest are a different thing from orders. I let them pass. I lay in the fern cover for a long time after they were gone, and I thought about what I had just decided, and whether it was weakness or something else, and I did not arrive at a clean answer. I am still not sure I have a clean answer. What I had was the sense that there was no remaining structure that my action would serve. And that action without serving a structure was just adding to what had already happened. And what had already happened was enough. I got up. I kept walking north. I found the hatchling on the 3rd day. I heard it first. Not a cry. Not the way a wounded animal cries, but a low intermittent clicking sound, like a cooling engine. Regular and rhythmic, in the way that living things are rhythmic when the rhythm is all that's left. I moved toward it because I was a scout, and moving toward sounds was what scouts did. And because the sound was small, and I was very tired of large, unresolvable things, the debris was from a speeder bike crash. Not mine, someone else's, that had come down through the canopy and taken a section of a lower branch with it. The branch was a limb from one of the old trees, as big around as a man's torso, and it had fallen across a depression in the root structure. And in the depression was the hatchling. I had seen the forest moon's wildlife in the abstract. Large moving shapes in the canopy. Tracks in soft ground. One occasion when a creature the size of a walker had stepped across our patrol route without breaking stride, and we had all stopped breathing until it was gone. I had not seen anything like this up close. It was small. Smaller than I expected, the length of my forearm from my elbow to my fingertips. The scaling was not yet full hardened. There was a softness to it the way there is with anything young, the scales still translucent at the edges in a pale pearl gray, shading towards something darker along the spine. It had wings, folded tight against its body. One of them wrong. Bent at a joint that should not have been bent that way. Which was why it was not in the canopy where things like it belonged. Its forelimbs were curled under it. Its eyes were open and they were amber, and there was nothing afraid in them. Only the precise, unclouded attention of something very old in a very young body, watching me approach. The clicking stopped when I got close. It looked at me. I looked at it. I had been told that the moon's indigenous life was not a consideration. Not hostile, not friendly, not relevant. It was fauna. Background. You did not interact with fauna. You noted its presence in your patrol log and moved on. I knelt down and looked at the wing joint. It was dislocated. Maybe fractured. The angle was wrong enough that it would not fly without intervention, and the creature was young enough that without flying, it would not eat. And it had already been here long enough. I could see from the way it held its body that it was past the point where the forest moon's biology was compensating for the problem on its own. The wing membrane was taut across the wrong architecture. The joint swelling had a specific angry heat to it that even through my armor gloves was perceptible, and had been perceptible, I estimated, for at least a full day. I did not have veterinary training. I had field medicine training that covered 8 categories of human injury and a brief, grimly practical section on what to do if your speeder bike fell on you. None of it covered this. There was no protocol. There was no doctrine. There was no chain of command to ask. What I had was a standard-issue emergency ration kit, which contained, among other things, a tube of high-density paste that was theoretically food for humans and practically food for anyone with a digestive system and low expectations. I had 3 of them left. I opened one and held it out. The hatchling looked at the tube, looked at me. A long, assessing look. The look of something that has been in a root depression for an unknown amount of time, and has developed a high standard of evidence for what constitutes trustworthy. Then it extended its neck, very slowly, with the precision of something that had been waiting to see if I was going to do something stupid, and it ate the ration mace off the tube with a small, rough tongue. I sat back on my heels and watched it eat and tried to work out how I felt about what I was doing. I did not work it out. I held the tube out until it was empty, and then I held out a second one, and the hatchling ate that too, with somewhat less suspicion and somewhat more appetite, and when it was done it clicked once, low and resonant in its small chest, and looked at me with those amber eyes and did not look away. I made a splint from the frame of my carbine's cleaning kit and 2 of the longer fern stems, padded with the thermal liner from my emergency pack. The hatchling held still while I worked. It made no sound at all, which was a quality I respected. I have worked with men who had less composure under a field dressing than this animal had under a process. It had no framework for, and no reason to trust. At one point it put its functional forelimb on my wrist, very lightly, with the specific weight of something communicating rather than gripping, and I stopped moving for a moment, and then continued. It kept its forelimb there until I finished. The splint would not heal the joint. It would immobilize it, which was a different thing. And whether immobilization was what this creature needed was beyond anything I could assess. But it was what I had, and I applied it with the same care I would have given a field dressing on a crewmate, because the only kind of work I knew how to do was careful work. Hasty work in the field kills people. The principle seemed to translate. I told myself I would move on in the morning. I did not move on in the morning. I stayed with the hatchling for 9 days. I should account for why, because it is not a small thing, 9 days. On the first morning after I found it, I moved perhaps 400 meters north before I stopped, and thought about the practical problem it presented. It could not fly. It could not hunt. Whatever the ecology of the forest moon dictated about how young dragon creatures survived, it did not appear to involve lying alone in a root depression while their wing mended. They had family structures, clearly, pack structures, from what I had observed of the larger adults moving through the upper canopy. Without the pack, alone, with one wing out of commission, the hatchling's prospects over the next week were precisely as bad as they looked. That was not my problem. I told myself that clearly. I turned around and went back. I justified it in pieces, the way you justify things you have already decided. The hatchling was a potential intelligence asset. It was clearly social, clearly part of a larger structure, and understanding the indigenous hierarchy of the forest moon was legitimate reconnaissance value. The hatchling's pack would likely return for it, and when they did, I would have a vector to observe a larger group. All of that was true. None of it was why I went back. Why I went back was that it had put its forelimb on my wrist with that specific weight. I had not had any contact that was not adversarial or entirely solitary in 11 days, and a small creature in a root depression had touched my wrist, and I had felt something I did not have a name for that I had been given to believe was not part of the job. I am not going to tell you I became a different person in the forest. That is not how it works. Person I was, careful, trained, disciplined, operating on doctrine even after the doctrine had lost its chain of command. That person stayed. He just did not have orders anymore. And, in the absence of orders, the things that were underneath the orders began to show up in the decisions. On the 4th day I found water, a rain-fed pool 200 meters east, and I carried it back in my helmet, which is not a use for a combat helmet that the design specifications contemplate. The hatchling drank from it in the focused, complete way that thirsty creatures drink when they have been thirsty longer than is comfortable. I refilled the helmet twice. Sun came through a gap in the canopy above the depression, and the hatchling moved into it slowly with the deliberate pleasure of something that understood warmth as a thing worth moving toward. I sat against the root structure and watched the light on the scales and watched the scales shift color slightly in the warmth, the pearl gray going almost silver where the sun caught off the edges. And I thought about nothing in particular for the first time in 11 days. I had 1.5 ration tubes left by the 5th day, and I was supplementing with what the forest provided. Certain berries that I had been briefed on as non-toxic during our environmental orientation. 2 kinds of fungus from the root structures. Water from the rain pool. Once a cache of something the forest floor's smaller fauna had stored in a hollow that turned out to be edible seeds. I was not comfortable. I was functional, which is different, and function without comfort is a sustainable state for someone who has spent 11 years being functional in conditions that were not comfortable. I split what I had with the hatchling on the 5th day without deciding to. I just opened the half tube and gave it the first portion and kept the rest for myself. It seemed equitable. We were both working with the same resources. I talked to it on the 6th day. Not about anything consequential. I told it about Corden, about the way Corden had eaten cold rations like a man who had made peace with all his choices. I told it about the speeder bike and the sound it made when you hit the thruster at full extension in a clear run between the big trees. That particular note that was part machine and part wind and part the specific mathematics of going somewhere faster than the place had expected. I told it about Davin, who had been from a water world and had never stopped being faintly surprised by the fact of trees. I told it about Moores, who was very young for a scout, the kind of young that means they have not yet been asked to pay the full price of the job. I told it that I did not know where any of them were, or whether there was anything left that constituted my chain of command or what I was supposed to do next. It clicked at me once, low from its chest while I was talking. I don't know either, I said. On the 7th day the wings started to look better. The angle was still, the swelling bulge round the joint had reduced, and it was taking more weight from its forelimb, which meant The compensating tension in its shoulder was easing. The wing membrane was less taut, the splint was holding. I checked the binding and adjusted it where it had shifted slightly, and the hatchling watched my hands while I worked with the same unafraid, total attention it had given me on the first day. It had decided at some point in the intervening days that I was worth watching carefully in the specific way you watch something that has been reliable so far, and you are continuing to verify. On the 8th day, something in the upper canopy was watching us. I noticed it the way you notice things when you have spent 11 years learning to notice things. Not because I saw anything specific, but because the quality of the forest's sounds shifted in a way that had nothing to do with wind or animal movement, that make sounds in a canopy make them continuously and variably, in a way that has a rhythm you learn. When something very large is very still in a canopy, the rhythm changes. The other things that make sounds adjust to the presence of the large still thing. They go quiet in a ring around it, the way a crowd goes quiet in a ring around a dignitary passing through. I'd learned that rhythm during the first weeks of the deployment, and I had learned to read it as a specific kind of information. Something very large, or several large things, was present at height and was still. I did not look up. I kept my hands where they were, checking the splint, adjusting the binding. My carbine was 3 meters away, leaning against the root structure where I had left it, because reaching for it around the hatchling felt wrong in a way I had learned to respect in myself. Not wrong in the way that wrong is a calculation about outcome. Wrong in the way that wrong is a recognition of what a thing means. The hatchling looked up, just for a moment, a flicker of those amber eyes toward the canopy, and then it looked back at me. I finished checking the splint. I opened the last of the ration tubes. I was running low, had been running low for days, was surviving on what the forest provided, which is not as much as recruitment materials would have you believe, and I held it out. The hatchling ate. The canopy above us was occupied and still, and had been since at least mid-morning. I said quietly, and to no one visible, "I don't have any more than this. I'm giving it what I have." The canopy did not answer. The stillness changed quality in a way that I did not have a word for. The specific quality of a held attention that has just registered something. That night, for the first time in 9 days, I slept through to morning without waking at every sound. I have thought about that since. I do not think it was coincidence. On the morning of the 9th day, I woke to find the hatchling had moved in the night. It was no longer in the root depression. I sat up fast, hand going to the carbine by reflex, and then I saw it. It was 4 meters away, at the edge of the root structure, in a shaft of early morning light. It was standing. Both forelimbs on the ground, both hind limbs bearing weight, the damaged wings extended slightly from its body, at an angle that was much closer to correct than it had been. The splint was still in place. It was testing the extension very slowly, with the careful attention of something that has been told not to trust a thing yet, and is running its own verification regardless. It saw me watching. It clicked, once, and then it folded the wing back against its body and walked to me with the slightly too careful gait of something whose confidence is ahead of its repair, and it sat down next to my knee, my hand on its back. The scales were warm, warmer than the air. Whatever metabolism ran these creatures ran hot, and that heat was comfortable in the specific way that the warmth of a living thing is always more than just warmth. "Getting better," I said. It clicked. "Good," I said. What happened next was not sudden. I want to be clear about that, because the word that comes to mind is descend, and descend implies something dramatic and fast. And this was neither. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was the specific measured movement of things that have nothing to prove and know it. They came down from the canopy one at a time. First was enormous. Not the largest thing I had seen on the forest moon, but close. The scaling was full and deep red, almost dark at the edges, with a ridge structure along the spine that caught the morning light and held it in the way metal holds light, as if the light is stored rather than reflected. It landed on the far side of the root structure, maybe 15 meters away, with less noise than I would have thought possible for something its size, and it folded its wings with the slowness of something performing a deliberate gesture rather than a physical action. Each fold careful, each position chosen. It looked at me. I did not move. My hand stayed on the hatchling's back. The carbine was where I had left it, 3 meters away against the root, and reaching for it now would be the last decision I ever made in any operational sense. And also it would be wrong in a way that had nothing to do with operational sense. The second came down on the left side, the third on the right, 2 more behind the first, flanking at angles that spoke of a pattern, a formation, not random placement but deliberate geometry. They were all looking at me. Not at the hatchling on my knee, at me. The hatchling was secondary to their attention. I was the point of it. I thought, very clearly, and without any particular emotion, this is how I die. And then I thought, with equal clarity, then I'll die with my hand where it is. The large dragon, the deep red one, with the ridge structure that caught the morning light, lowered its head. Not a strike, not a lunge. It brought its head down slowly, with the weight of something measuring the distance between its eyes and mine, until we were on a level. Its eyes were amber, the same amber as the hatchlings. I had not thought about that until that moment. The same amber, the same quality of total attention that I had been looking at for 9 days in a much smaller face. It held there. Its breath moved the ferns at the base of the root structure between us. It smelled of old forest, and something older than forest. The specific smell of a thing that has been alive long enough to have become part of the chemistry of a place. My hand was on the hatchling's back. I could feel the hatchling breathing, calm and steady, the way it had breathed on my wrist when it first put its forelimb there, and held that specific weight that meant something beyond grip. I had spent 11 years being told what the galaxy was, and how it was organized, and what my place in it was. I had been given a uniform and a carbine, and a set of doctrines and a chain of command. And I had followed the chain without thinking too hard about where it led, because following the chain was the job, and I was good at the job. I had not thought about the chain being wrong. You don't while it holds. Think about it. Aft parts. Lying in ferns with blood drying on your helmet, listening to one ship running for orbit in the dark. The large dragon's eyes were amber. They were 9 days old to me. I had fed this animal's child with paste from a tube, and built it a splint from fern stems, and carried water in my helmet, and sat against a root structure talking to it about my missing squad, and the sound of a speeder bike at full extension between the old trees. And none of it had been for any strategic reason, or in service of any chain of command. Because there was no chain of command, because what I had been was over and what came next was not yet clear. I don't know what I'm supposed to tell you, I said. Quietly. No sudden movements. The wing needed a splint. I had materials. That's the whole of it. The dragon's eyes moved to the hatchling, to the splint, to my hand on the hatchling's back, then back to me. Then, with a slowness that had nothing to do with reluctance and everything to do with intention, it lowered its head further, past the level of my eyes, down and forward, inclined at an angle that I recognized the way you recognize a thing you have never been taught, but have somehow always known. It was not threatening, it was not approaching, it was acknowledging, not me as an obstacle overcome or a threat assessed and dismissed, acknowledging me as a thing that had been observed and evaluated and found to be a specific kind of thing. 2 flanking dragons did the same. The 2 behind them did the same. 5 enormous scaled creatures, deep in a forest. In the morning light, heads lowered in the direction of one man sitting against a root structure, with a small hatchling on his knee and a splint made of fern stems. I sat very still with my hand on the hatchling's back, and tried to work out what to do with that, and arrived at nothing useful, so I did not do anything. I did not leave with them. I want to be precise about that too, because what happened next is easy to misread, and the misreading is its own kind of error. The large dragon rose from its inclination after a long moment and opened its wings slightly. Not a threat display, nothing so blunt as that. More like a door left ajar, an indication of direction. The 2 flanking dragons rose also. The hatchling on my knee got to its feet and walked 2 steps toward them, and then stopped, and looked back at me with those amber eyes. I looked at the hatchling. I looked at the large dragon. I looked at the carbine against the root structure, 3 meters away, which I had not picked up once in 9 days. I looked at the forest around me, and the morning light coming through the canopy, and the specific quality of the air on the forest moon, which had its own smell that I had been in long enough to stop noticing. Which is what happens with smells when you stay somewhere. Go on, I said. The hatchling walked to the large dragon. The large dragon lowered its head and touched the hatchling's neck with the side of its jaw in a gesture that needed no translation. Then the hatchling unfurled the damaged wing, slowly, carefully, testing, and finding it better than it had been, finding the splint holding, finding the geometry returning to something workable. It climbed the large dragon's foreleg and settled against its shoulder with the competence of something returning to its proper place. They went back up into the canopy the same way they had come down, slowly, without urgency. The lesser dragons, first, ascending through the canopy layers with a scale and wing silence, that something that size should not have been capable of. The deep red one was last, and before it went, it held that amber gaze on me for a moment, that lasted long enough to mean something deliberate, not a threat, not a warning. The look of something that has made a record of a thing and is noting the record's completion. Then it was gone. Forest went on. Things that were not birds moved in the middle canopy. The old trees breathed their old breath. A patch of morning light moved across the root structure where the hatchling had been. I sat against the roots for a long time. I found the rebel checkpoint on the 11th day, which in retrospect means I had been walking toward it since day 9. Since the morning the pack came down and went back up. I had not consciously decided to walk toward it. I had just stopped walking away from things and started walking without a particular direction that was away, and in the absence of a way, toward resolves itself naturally. The forest was large and I was in it, and there was a war, or the aftermath of a war, happening on its edges, and I had no more business pretending to be separate from that. Walked south, then west. I found rebel perimeter markers, orange tape on branches, and I followed them inward toward their source, the way you follow any navigational marker when you have decided to arrive somewhere. The checkpoint was 2 rebel soldiers and a portable scanner unit at a trail junction. They were young, not young the way combat troops are young, ground down and careful. Young in the way of people who have not yet been required to stop being young. They were talking to each other when I walked out of the fern cover with my hands out and my carbine left back against the root structure where I had last set it down. The scanner unit read my armor the moment I cleared the fern line, and both of them had weapons on me before I had taken 3 steps. I had expected that. I kept my hands out and my posture even, and I did not move fast or speak until they told me to speak. There was a great deal of shouted instruction, which I followed without particular urgency, because the urgency did not seem relevant. And then there were more of them. And then there was a small room with a locking door that smelled like damp ground sheet, and a rebel intelligence officer with the kind of careful eyes that had seen a good deal of the war from the analytical side. Name was Sira. She had short hair and a scar along her jaw that had been there long enough to be silver, which meant it was from before this posting, from an earlier version of the same conflict. She sat across the table from me with a data pad, and she looked at me for a moment before she said anything. Treat, the look of someone taking a reading before they commit to an interpretation. You've been out there since the battle, she said. Not a question. Yes, 11 days. 9 with the hatchling. 2 walking. She did not look at the data pad. Tell me about the hatchling, so I told her. I told her the whole of it. The root depression, the dislocated wing, the ration paste, the fern stem splint, the water in the helmet, the 8 days until the pack came down. I told her what the large dragon had done, and I used the word acknowledged because it was the closest word I had for it. And I told her about the inclination of the heads and the amber eyes, and the quality of the stillness before they rose. She listened without interrupting. She did not write anything on the data pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you understand what the Dragon Compact is?" I said I did not. She told me. The Dragon Compact was old. Older than the Empire, older than the Republic before it, older than most of the agreements that organized the galaxy into the shapes that governments then claimed credit for. It was an agreement between the species of the forest moon, the scaled wing hierarchy, who are not called dragons except by outsiders, except that the name has been used long enough that they accept it with the mild tolerance of something secure enough in its own name not to care about yours. and whatever civilizations periodically descended from the sky to build things in their forest. The agreement was not written. Written agreements were a mammalian preference. The scaled wing hierarchy operated on a system of demonstrated conduct, extended over time, verified by direct observation. They observe everything that happens in their forest, Sarah said. Everything. Their canopy coverage is complete. There are never fewer than 3 adults within observation range of any point on the moon's surface. The Emperor himself maintains a personal watch rotation. I thought about the 8th day. Quality of the canopy sounds shifting. Something large, or several large things, present and still. They were watching from the first day, I said. Certainly. Before I knew they were there. That's how it works. That's the point of it, actually. The compact specifically requires that conduct be observed without the subject's awareness. Formed virtue doesn't count. They're very clear about that distinction. I thought about the rebel patrol on the 2nd day. The 4 soldiers laughing, moving through my sector with their weapons slung, and me, prone in the ferns, deciding against the carbine, not because the odds were bad, but because the action had no remaining structure to serve. I thought about what that decision had looked like from the canopy. They watched me let a rebel patrol pass, I said. Yes, they watched me not pick up the carbine when they came down. Yes, she was quiet. I was quiet. The room smelled of damp ground sheet. Outside the door I could hear the sounds of a functioning military facility. Measured, purposeful. The sounds of an organization that knows what it is and where it is going. And it was the most alien sound I had encountered in 11 days. Does demonstrated conduct mean exactly? I asked. In terms of the compact, Sarah looked at me. Perk. She had the kind of eyes that measured carefully before they answered. It means, she said, that when the Dragon Emperor makes a judgment about a person's character, based on what he has directly observed over time, without performance or awareness of observation, that judgment is considered a matter of record. Within the compact's framework, non-negotiable, non-revisable, he has made the observation and he has made the judgment, and those 2 things stand. The large one, the deep red one with the ridge structure. That would be him, yes. I sat with that. Outside the room, the military facility went about its business. What does a matter of record mean? I said. Practically, it means, Sarah said slowly, like someone measuring each word for weight before setting it down, that you are known on this moon to be a specific kind of person. Shh. And that knowledge is shared throughout the hierarchy. And the entities who share it are very old and have very long memories, and their reach, through the compact and through agreements that predate most of what we call political history, extends considerably. I didn't know they were watching, I said. I know. I did it because the wing needed a splint. I know, she said. That's the point. That's exactly the point. There is a conversation that happens when a prisoner exchanges one kind of custody for another, and I am not going to tell you it was easy or resolved itself quickly. 11 years of service does not become 11 years of error in the space of a conversation. Even a conversation conducted with as much honesty as I was capable of at that point, which I will grant, was limited by the fact that I was also processing the specific shock of a war ending without my knowledge while I was on the wrong side of it. I told them what I knew about the shield generator installation. Most of it, they already knew. They had walked into that bunker and taken it apart with their own hands, and the whole thing had been several weeks prior, by the time I was sitting in the room with the locking door. Some of it was useful. Patrol routes in sectors they hadn't fully mapped. Secondary communication protocols. The location of a secondary power relay that hadn't been in the installation schematics they'd captured. I'm not proud of that calculation, but I made it, because the alternative was loyalty to a chain of command that had resolved itself into one ship running for orbit in the dark. And that is not enough of a thing to hold to when the choice is between it and something that might grow into a different kind of future. Corden was alive. I found that out on the 3rd day of custody. He had been taken the morning of the battle, before the rout, before any of us had understood what was happening. He was in a different part of the compound, cooperative in the way that Corden was cooperative with things that could not be changed. Matter of fact, no point heating cold rations when cold is what you have. We saw each other once in the hallway between 2 escorted movements. And he nodded at me with the specific nod of a man who has assessed a situation and found it to be what it is. And I nodded back, and that was most of what there was to say. We had shared enough bad situations to be economical about the ones that couldn't be changed. Davin was dead. The rebels told me straight, and I will tell it straight here. He had been taken in the initial assault, and he had not made it through the night. It was not the rebels. It was the chaos of the route, medical resources that reached other people first, the arithmetic of a battle in which many people were hurt, and not all of them could be reached. I did not expect to feel it the way I felt it. I had been prepared for Davin to be dead for 11 days. Running the probability in the back of my thinking, the way you run probabilities when you have no information. The confirmation was different from the probability, was smaller and heavier, and it sat in a place in my chest that the probability had not reached. We never found, which is its own kind of answer. The forest is large. On my 22nd day in the compound, Sarah came to the room with the locking door, which had been unlocked, at that point, for several days, on a basis of I will not call it trust so much as acknowledge mutual constraint. And she told me there was someone who wanted to speak with me. She took me to a room with a large window. The window looked out over the forest. It was late afternoon, and the light through the old-growth canopy was that specific quality of late afternoon forest light that turns everything it touches amber. I stood at the door for a moment before I entered, because the quality of the light and the quality of the moment had something in common that I wanted to register before it passed. In the room, standing at the window with its back to me, was the large dragon. It was smaller inside the room than it had been in the forest, which sounds nonsensical but is true. The forest had provided a scale that made its size feel natural, integrated, part of the logic of the place. The room provided a scale that made the same size feel different. It filled the space without crowding it, the way that genuinely large things sometimes do, not diminished by enclosure but simply present in it, on terms it set. The ridge structure along its spine caught the late afternoon light through the window the same way it had caught morning light in the forest, as if it was designed to hold whatever light was available. When it turned at the sound of my entering, those amber eyes held the same total attention they had held across the root structure on the 9th morning. It looked at me for a long, specific moment. Then it lowered its head. The same inclination, the same deliberate angle it had held in the forest, and held it there. I stood very still. Then, because it was the only appropriate response I had for a thing I did not have language for, I bowed. Not a military bow, not the formal acknowledgement of a superior officer. Something more than that, or perhaps the same thing arrived at from a different direction, through different experience. I inclined my head and held it there for the same duration it held its, and we rose at the same time, and for a moment we were both simply upright in the same space, looking at each other. The dragon turned back to the window. I stood beside it, and we looked out at the forest together. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that the 9 days had not already said, and saying it in words would have been a lesser version. In the upper canopy, I could see the hatchling. I could not have said how I knew it was the same one, but I knew, the way you know certain things without being able to account for the knowing. Moving between branches with the careful confidence of a wing that was mending, Splint was gone. The angle of the extension was almost right. "It's flatter," I said. The dragon clicked, low and resonant from deep in its chest. The same sound the hatchling had made from the root depression when I had talked about Corden and the speeder bike. Stood at the window until the light went amber, and then went gold, and then the upper canopy went dark against a sky that was still bright. The specific moment of late evening that lasts 10 minutes and feels longer. I am telling this from a distance of several years now, not so many years that the details have gone soft. I am not at an age where the details go soft easily, and these particular details have the kind of edge that stays sharp, because it was earned by the kind of experience that leaves marks. But enough years that I can tell it, without the story pulling me under while I'm telling it. I did not stay on the forest moon. That was never an option, for reasons both practical and personal that I do not need to explain in full. What the new government offered me was what they offered everyone who came in from the imperial side, with something to offer and something to answer for. A reckoning. Of a kind. Clean. Nothing about it was clean. You don't spend 11 years as a functional part of something that turned out to be what the Empire turned out to be, and then step clean onto the other side. The reckoning was real, and it took time, and it cost things I am not going to inventory here, because the inventory is mine and not the story's. What I can say is that I answered for what I had been part of. I took stock of what I had known and chosen not to examine it. And I examined it with the same thoroughness I had given the hatchling's wing joint, because that was the only kind of work I knew how to do. Careful work. The kind that takes as long as it takes, and does not stop before it's done, because stopping before it's done means the problem remains. I was given work. I was given, eventually, a role in the New Order's effort to map the Forest Moon's indigenous hierarchy and establish the terms of the Dragon Compact for the incoming Republic administration. Because it turned out that, having been observed by the Emperor himself, having that observation recorded as a matter of record within the Compact's framework, was a form of credential that the Compact's signatories recognized and the Republic found useful. I had not planned this. I had done it by accident while trying not to let a small creature die, a root depression. And the accident had become something that had become something. What I know now that I did not know then is that the Dragon Emperor's judgment under the Compact carries weight in more places than the Forest Moon. The scaled wing hierarchy is old, and their memory is long, and their reach, through a network of ancient agreements that predate most of what we call civilization, is considerable. I did not know this when I knelt in a root depression with ration paste and fern stems. It would not have changed anything if I had. That is not me being modest. That is me being precise. If I had known they were watching from the first day, if I had known the Emperor himself was in the canopy, observing me, building a record of my demonstrated conduct, I would have been performing. I would have been running a calculation. I would have been a soldier doing something useful for a strategic reason. And whatever the result looked like on the outside, it would have been a different thing on the inside, and things that are different on the inside from the outside eventually resolve to their inside. The Compact accounts for this. The Compact is specifically designed around this. You cannot earn the record by knowing the record is being kept. That is the entire architecture of the thing. I did because the wing needed a splint and I had materials. That is the true thing. Everything that came after came from that. Corden found me, eventually. Not on the moon. Later, on a different world. At a time when both of us were something other than what we had not been, and were working out what we were going to become. He walked into a room I was in and said, "Cold rations," and I said, "Not worth heating." And that was the reunion, which was the right length for it. We had coffee, which was hot, because neither of us had a point to make any more about temperature. He had been told, by someone in the New Order's intelligence structure, some version of what had happened to me in the forest. He had the look of a man who had been told a thing, and had not quite finished deciding what to do with it. "Dragon," he said, "a hatchling. You fed it your rations, and split the last one." He was quiet. He drank his coffee. He had a specific silence that meant he was working something out methodically and would report when finished. And I had known him long enough to give it the space it needed. "The Emperor was in the canopy," he said finally, "apparently, watching. From what I understand, yes. The whole 9 days, or most of them. And he saw all of it. That's how the Compact works." He was quiet again. Cup slowly in his hands. A thing I had seen him do during briefings, when he was processing a variable he hadn't accounted for. Outside the window of the place we were sitting, which was not a forest, which was a city, which was a world that was getting on with the complicated, unneat business of being. After the thing that had happened, people moved in the streets below with the specific energy of people who have survived something, and are now astonished by the fact of surviving it. "You didn't know," Corden said. "No, you would have done it anyway." I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was the one I gave. "I think so. I don't know for certain. I know I went back, when I told myself I wouldn't. I know the fern stem splint was the only kind of work I could do, so I did it the only way I know how. I know I talked to it for 9 days because I needed something to talk to. Whether I would have done it if I'd known, I can't say. I didn't know. That's what the compact requires. Corden nodded. He drank the last of his coffee. He set the cup down with the same care he had given everything he had ever handled, cold rations or otherwise. The care of a man who has understood somewhere along the way that how you do the small things is the whole of how you are, that there is no separation between the person who handles the small thing and the person who faces the large thing. You are the same person doing both. Yeah, he said. That sounds right. We sat there for a while. Two men on the far side of the thing we had been part of, and the city went on below us, and the day went on around us. And I thought about amber eyes and morning light on scales, and the specific weight of a small creature's forelimb resting on my wrist while the work continued. You don't choose what finds you when you're lost. You choose what you do with it when it does. That is the whole of it. That is everything there is to say.